delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present today Maoism, a global history, Julia Lovell in conversation with Michael Puett. With the growing friction between China and the world exacerbated in the wake of the pandemic, the need to understand the political legacy of Mao is urgent and growing. In Maoism, a global history, eminent British scholar, author and translator Julia Lovell takes on the ambitious and challenging task of covering the sweeping and turbulent history of Maoism in one accessible text, bringing attention to Mao and his ideas in new light. Through a series of interviews, archival references and ethnographic study, Lovell synthesizes concurrent narratives and conceptions, providing a re-evolution of the ideology in the present context. She discusses her exciting work in conversation with historian and writer Michael Puett in an essential session on the enduring appeal of Maoism. Julia Lovell is Professor of Modern China at Birkbeck College, University of London. She is the author of Maoism, A Global History, 2019 Cundill History Prize and the Opium War, 2012 Jan Michalski Prize. Her many translations of modern Chinese fiction into English include The Real History of RQ and Monkey King. Michael Puett is the Walter Klein Professor of Chinese History and Anthropology at Harvard University. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Maoism, A Global History, Julia Lovell in conversation with Michael Puett.
Thank you so much. And Julia, it is such an honor to be here in conversation with you. I've long been an admirer of your work, but if it's possible to grade outstanding books, this might be your most amazing one. It is an incredible book that really brings Maoism to our understanding, explaining why it's been so important, obviously in China, but as the title of the book correctly argues, it's really a global history that forces us to rethink the past 80 years of global history. So thank you so much. And I would love to begin our conversation right there. As you note in your introduction, this is the first global history of Maoism that has yet been written, even though we are dealing with an ideology that has arguably been one of the two, at most three, ideologies that has most affected the world. Why do you think, especially in the Euro-American world, that Maoism has been so underappreciated and so misunderstood?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Michael, for that very generous introduction. And it's wonderful to be speaking on this platform with you. And that's a really great question to begin with. And after I thought of the idea of the book some 7 or so years ago, my next emotion was one of surprise. So why doesn't this book already exist? You know, given the vast numbers of books that we have about the global impact of Stalin and Hitler, and given that Mao is generally seen as a comparable figure, I wondered, why didn't we have a single volume history of global Maoism? Why haven't people tended to see Mao or Maoism globally, at least in the Anglo-American or in the Western European world? I think there are a few reasons, some to do with Western views of history, others more to do specifically with China. First, I think that the spread and importance of Mao's ideas have been effaced by the end of the Cold War, especially since the communist collapse in Europe and the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1981. Many Western governments, I think, imagined that Maoism was a historical and a political phenomenon past its sell-by date. There was no need to engage seriously with it because Maoism, like all communist ideologies, had been left in the dust by the supposed death of ideology in 1989. There's also a greater sense of cultural and political distance between, say, Western countries and China, wider than the sense of distance with Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia, that has made it easier to ignore Maoism and Chinese history more generally. It's led to a sort of greater sense of detachment, I think. But it's important to point out that the People's Republic of China, the PRC, has also been invested in effacing the global history of Maoism. Now, for the last 20 or so years, China's rulers have theorized that the country will have a peaceful rise in contrast to the violence of the rise of the West. And history is a really important part of this narrative. So government publicity in China repeats that China has never interfered in the sovereign affairs of other countries. And under these circumstances, China doesn't want to illuminate its desire for leadership of the world revolution during the Maoist period. Remember, this was a time when China exported not only ideology in the form of hundreds of millions of copies of the Little Red Book, but it also exported harder currencies of revolution, so money, weapons, and training for global insurgencies, especially in the developing world. And then because this history raises so many sensitive political issues for the CCP today, for the Chinese Communist Party today, it's hard to research. So many key archival histories and oral histories remain out of reach. So the writing of this book was, the process of writing the book was as global really as the contents. It required me to travel to many countries to access materials in many different languages, different archives, to carry out a great range of oral history interviews and so on and so forth. So it's not just intellectually challenging, but also logistically challenging.
And let me say, as a reader, this comes through beautifully in the book. Not the challenging part, but the challenging degree to which you work through this material and bring it together so gorgeously. It's an amazing book to read. Not only do you trace the history of Maoism incredibly powerfully, but you do so by weaving in these incredible stories, that you bring the reader into all of these archives and oral histories that you've done. So we can see the incredible work that went behind it, but you bring us in and just bring the entire history of Maoism to life. So thank you again. And
I'm so glad you did mention that.
Oh, but it really is. It's an extraordinary work. What I would love to turn to next is the kind of impossible question of what is Maoism? So certainly in the Euro-American world, we tend to think of Maoism as just a branch of communism. So it's part and parcel of Leninism, Stalinism, and part of the power of your book is you're arguing, no, that's really not the case, that Mao really did take the communist movement in a very new direction that's had a fundamental impact on the world ever since. Can you give us a sense of sort of what is Maoism? Not as a single ideology, but in terms of its contradictory tendencies that you lay out so beautifully.
Well, again, a really important and pivotal question. I start by underlining that Maoism, although it sounds like a unitary ideology when you express it like that, Maoism doesn't mean only one thing. So it stands for a wide range of theory and practice attributed to Mao over the past 80 years. And these ideas have been translated and mistranslated on their journeys around China and the world. A really good couple of examples being from South Asia itself, so India and Nepal, the way that Mao's ideas have been sort of received and adapted in those two countries. And so I think one of the reasons why this thing, which we call Maoism, has been able to take root in very diverse places and moments is down to its contradictory and malleable nature. Having said that, it is possible to identify some standout characteristics that differentiate Maoism from earlier forms of Marxism-Leninism, so Leninism or Stalinism. And some of these differences are in kind and others in degree. And just as a note about chronology, these ideas which we associate with Maoism come into formal existence in the 1940s when the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, coins the term Mao Zedong thought, but they have their antecedents in earlier parts of Mao's career. So I'd start by pointing out that within the context of Chinese communism, Mao was particularly notable for championing the use of political violence to achieve his revolution. And a couple of his most famous catchphrases, which I know are famous in India because people have mentioned them to me, a couple of his most famous catchphrases, power comes out of the barrel of a gun, and revolution is not a dinner party, express this idea. And so Mao has been celebrated by insurgents all over the world as the architect of a defiant, protracted guerrilla warfare. And as a historian, I'd argue that Lenin and Stalin were not as closely associated with the army and with military strategy as Mao was at such a formative moment in his career. Second, Mao acclaimed the revolutionary potential of peasants, so he emphasised their role more than that of urban workers. Of course, Marxist theory had identified urban workers as the motor of revolution and been rather scornful about the revolutionary power of farmers of rural areas. And this was a really crucial step in adapting Chinese communism to China, where the population until recently was mostly rural. It also popularised Mao's ideas in other parts of the developing world after 1949. Of course, this is the high point of decolonisation. So you've got new rural states winning independence from decolonisation. And so in this context, Mao's blueprint for transforming, for revolutionising, for modernising a poor agrarian country had huge appeal. Again, India's a good example of this. There's also a powerful feminist rhetoric in Mao's ideas. He famously said that women can hold up half the sky. Very sadly, Mao's own practice, he was a serial womanizer, fell far short of this theory, but it is a sort of nugget within his ideology that some have seized hold of. Now, partly through historical contingency, namely the People's Republic of China was founded in the era of decolonisation in 1949, Mao has been seen as the champion of anti-colonialism, of anti-imperialism. And this reputation has also been forged by his talent for sound bites. So he once remarked that imperialism is a paper tiger. You know, this sound bite expresses his defiance of the colonial powers. And again, in the developing world, this message of anti-imperialism really appealed to peoples who had been repressed by Western colonialism. And I'm just going to deal with my last 2 or 3 characteristics together to communicate some of the paradoxes of Mao's ideas. Now, Mao was a profoundly autocratic man, and he sponsored his own personality cult. He created an iron framework for party discipline, which was designed to ensure homogeneity of thought. And this method of party building has been copied by many far left parties outside China, for example, in Vietnam, also in Cambodia. At the same time, though, very strangely, Mao always saw himself throughout his life as an outlier, as a rebel. And during the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 1976, he incited millions of young people to rebel against the party establishment, which he thought was turning conservative, counter-revolutionary and bourgeois. So another of his really famous catchphrases is to rebel is justified. And for this reason, many radicals all over the world have also lionized Mao as the champion of rebellion. So I suppose I would say in conclusion that Maoism is this very curious, paradoxical political creed that at the same time reveres centralized party leadership, collective obedience, but also anti-state rebellion.
Absolutely fascinating. And I would love to just hear a little bit more on the last point that you mentioned, because I agree. I mean, this is one of the things that has been so fascinating about China, and as we will see momentarily, about the global spread of Maoism. And that is precisely this extreme emphasis on constant revolution. So returning to the point you made at the very, very tail end about the Cultural Revolution, Could you say a few more words about this? This is, I think, one of the few moments when, again, especially in the West, the difference between what was going on in China and, say, what was going on in the Soviet Union became so profound, when here you have a Communist Party seemingly very, very powerful, and suddenly the leader is calling on the students to overthrow his own party and literally send the party members out to the countryside to end their rule. Could you give us a sense here of what was going on there?
Yeah, I think it's really important to bear in mind that the Cultural Revolution is a unique event within the history of global communism. It is the only instance of the leader of a party in power, a leader who has built this party in power. The only instance of such a leader actually inciting the grassroots, sort of mobilizing the grassroots to attack that party. And so, not surprisingly, other communist parties in power at the time, see the Soviet Union, North Korea, North Vietnam, and so on, were horrified and bewildered by the Cultural Revolution. They thought it was an absolutely terrible idea. But the Cultural Revolution, as you point out so well, was a really important motor in vectoring Mao's ideas, or at least one interpretation of Mao's ideas around the world. So, the late 1960s is the moment when Mao becomes seen as this global champion of rebellion in a sort of great variety of territories. So you have the famous 1968 counterculture protests in the United States and in Western Europe. And this is a time when Mao's slogans are being sort of scrawled across walls, people of student faculties in Paris, in the US. You're having the Little Red Book, the so-called Mao Bible, circulating incredibly widely, it being a kind of accessory of student protest. But also in the developing world, this is the moment at which India's Maoist movement, which is still with us, takes off in the cities and in North India. It's also a moment that sort of sows the seeds for later Maoist insurgencies. So I'm thinking particularly here of men like Abimael Guzman, a Peruvian communist who visits China for military and political training in the sort of mid to late 1960s. And there he gathers ideas which will absolutely infuse the Maoist insurgency that he leads against the Peruvian state throughout the 1980s and the early 90s, which is sort of well known around the world as Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso.
Absolutely fascinating. And you note as well that many of these key figures actually physically went to China. So Guzman himself physically went to China at this key moment during the onset of the Cultural Revolution. And that really is the key moment when that part of Mao, the Mao that was beginning the Cultural Revolution, really began its global spread.
Yes, and it's and the influence of Mao's ideas and Mao's China was vectored in different ways. I think there was a big impact from print culture, these hundreds of millions of copies of the Little Red Book, which became really incredibly fashionable in cities all over the world. But there were also more practical types of help offered. So military and political training camps, both in South, East and North China, became centres for a kind of diverse community of floating global revolutionaries from Latin America, some from Europe, some from Africa. Another example of how this period really has afterlives in terms of shaping the destinies of the countries and states from which these revolutionaries come, is that of what was then Southern Rhodesia and what becomes Zimbabwe after 1980. So the kind of military architect of the insurgency against the sort of racist white dominant rule over Southern Rhodesia, the kind of military architect of that insurgency, is a man called Josiah Tongagora, who again, like Abimael Guzman, is in China in the second half of the 1960s, learning kind of political military strategy, which he and the other people that he trains back in Africa will apply directly and very successfully in fighting a really grim civil war against the Southern Rhodesian state throughout the 1970s.
Absolutely fascinating. So to continue the global history, as you mentioned, this moment, the Cultural Revolution, the ideology of Maoism during that key moment has, as you've noted, just an extraordinary impact on India, Nepal, Peru. I mean, it's incredible. Certainly in Europe and the US too, with the student movements. Then seemingly it comes to an end in China. So Mao passes away, as you note. A very different form of government seems to arise in China, very much aimed at rebuilding the party to actually control the state again. Mao as a figure, and certainly the Mao of the Cultural Revolution, seems actively to be being pushed aside. And then, as you note, no, on the contrary, Mao is having an incredible resurgence in China. So I would love to hear a few more words about that. What is going on? Why the incredible appeal of Mao, both in the population, but also in a government that would seemingly not be terribly supportive of an ongoing revolution against itself?
It's another really interesting and complicated question. I would put a particular date on China's most recent Mao revival to give a sort of brief sense of the history. Absolutely, you're right. Mao dies, it's in September 1976, and his successors quite quickly sort of dismantle the keynote policies of what we might call high Maoism, so the Cultural Revolution. So things like big communes, collectives, and so on, and also these kind of very destructive mass movements, so kind of big spectacle purges and so on. What replaces that is what one might broadly describe as a kind of authoritarian capitalism. So there is increasing economic freedom. There is a return to private ownership and private enterprise. And those policies and the sort of huge energy that ordinary Chinese people throw into these new opportunities, all this kind of creates the Chinese economic miracle that we've witnessed over recent decades and that we're contemplating today. I would argue that Mao never completely goes away. Obviously, his dead body is, his embalmed dead body still lies at the center of Tiananmen Square. So this is the heartland of political power in China. His huge portrait hangs just a few dozen meters north of his dead body along the northern edge of Tiananmen Square. But you're absolutely right that sort of official state policy it's very much turned away from the kind of utopian turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. And a really interesting cultural moment, I think, is the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics, in which the kind of cultural reference points range from hosts of drummers chanting quotations from Confucius, sort of through to sort of hyper modern acrobats in fluorescent green spandex, and yet so you've got the full span of Chinese history, sort of from the sort of earliest written texts through to kind of China's contemporary dazzling modernity. But within that span, the Maoist period was completely passed over, and I think that really expresses the sense of awkwardness that China's rulers after Mao have felt about how to deal with the legacy of Mao. But there's also been, I think, a step change in China beginning in 2012 with the accession to power of the current ruler, Xi Jinping. And at this point, Xi Jinping makes the decision that he's going to embark on the first public official revival of Maoist culture and politics since the death of Mao in 1976. This is partly because the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is facing a crisis of legitimacy. It's sort of facing existentially threatening levels of corruption. And so sort of in this very dangerous situation, Xi Jinping decided to reassert legitimacy by re-emphasizing ideological control and aspects of Maoist political culture. Things like criticism, self-criticism sessions, Mao's famed policy of the mass line, and above all, the personality cult. So you've really seen a personality cult surrounding Xi Jinping, which you didn't see surrounding his other post-Mao predecessors. But I would also say that Mao enjoys a very ambiguous, unstable legacy in contemporary China. So Xi Jinping and other leaders of the CCP, they want to exploit a kind of father of the nation symbolism from Mao to bolster their own rule, to bolster their own legitimacy. But as you pointed out, there are major aspects of the Maoist heritage that Xi Jinping is very uncomfortable with and is determined to suppress. And above all, the bottom-up mobilizations of the Cultural Revolution that almost destroyed the party state and indeed Xi Jinping's own family in the 1960s. And so China today is ruled by an authoritarian capitalism, not by the utopian turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. But the interesting thing here is that there are, despite the attempts by the CCP to control the legacy of Mao, there are large parts of Maoism that continue to flourish beyond that party control. So one really interesting moment is the late 1990s, when the CCP is having a privatization drive. It's dismantling urban welfare and job security. And at this moment, workers who've been laid off from the big state-owned enterprises, the state-owned factories, they take to marching in protest, and on these protests they'll often brandish portraits of Mao, who in this context has become an object of nostalgia. He's a patron saint of workers' rights, so he sort of represents a time when workers' rights were looked after in contrast to the harsh realities of post-Mao China. And there are plenty of neo-Maoists in China today who are sort of really angry at the inequalities which have been generated by the market and by globalization. And in their own publications, mostly online, they quote Mao, particularly the Mao of the Cultural Revolution. So things like rebel is justified. So Mao's incitement during the 1960s to rebel against the state. Again, this makes the CCP extremely uncomfortable, and the party has done its best to silence these tendencies, or at least to co-opt them. So this Maoist revival we're seeing in China today is very partial. She wants to invoke Mao to shore up his own legitimacy, but he's not at all interested in returning to the militancy of Mao that was so destabilizing nationally and internationally. And I'm so glad that you made that important point, that Xi Jinping's China is different almost beyond recognition from Mao. So it's tied into global finance, its stability is bound to economic performance, and its media is too diversified for a single old style ideological message to convince its citizens. And so the question that really preoccupied me as I finished the book was, how will Xi Jinping's selective revival of the Maoist political repertoire sit in a China that is so transformed from the Mao era?
Absolutely fascinating. And just building directly upon that, this is, you've noted, extremely ambivalent history in China recently of Xi Jinping, an authoritarian capitalist, claiming to follow Mao, and yet Mao is also, as you've noted, the figure underlying protest movements against Xi. I would love at this moment to broaden out our discussion yet again to the rest of the world. So given this ambivalent legacy, what are the other ambivalent legacies we see in Maoism around the world? In particular, I'm thinking perhaps India and Nepal that you touched on briefly. How has Maoism played out in places like India and Nepal? And do you see a comparable ambivalence playing out?
I think there have been a number of unintended consequences of the export of Mao's ideas and practices around the world. So the kind of fulcrum of this export is this kind of moment of high utopian radicalism, which you see in the Cultural Revolution, where Mao is trying to create in China this state of extreme egalitarianism. He's trying to abolish all private property, or sort of thoughts and practices and cultures that might exist outside this extremely politically puritanical culture. And he and his sort of lieutenants are extremely ruthless in and paranoid in dealing with those who they suspect of sort of militating against this vision of theirs. So you see this moment in the late 1960s of sort of very clear ambition to achieve this state within China, but also to reach out to other parts of the world. But the results of this enterprise are very unpredictable, unstable, and often unintended. So a couple of examples I might give here. I mean, one is the impact of Mao's ideas of sort of radical politics in the West, so in Western Europe and in the United States. So these ideas of the Cultural Revolutions underpin the radical left-wing politics of the late 1960s and the 1970s. But of course, if you look at what happens in the 1980s, particularly in countries like the UK, the US, or Italy, what you're seeing is not the kind of fruition of that sort of energetic leftist politics, but in fact sort of swing back of sort of right-wing conservative politics. It's the era of neoliberalism. So you see this with Reagan in the US, Thatcher in the UK. And some historians argue that it is specifically the political puritanism of these Maoist movements of the 1970s, which become sort of desperately sectarian, and they divide and they discredit the radical left wing, in 2 countries, in Western Germany and in Italy. Maoist movements are part of sort of urban terrorist groups which commit sort of multiple acts of sort of kidnapping and murder. So there are some that argue that the Maoist upsurge, which looks so energetic and vibrant in the late 60s and 1970s, sort of actually helped pave the way for the victory of sort of right-wing conservatism and neoliberalism through the 1980s. Returning though to South Asia, which I'm really keen to do, I think that the outcome of Maoism's travels to these 2 countries provides us with 2 of the most interesting examples of translations, but also mistranslations, adaptations, and even distortions of Mao's original creed. So both these Maoist movements sort of come from this moment in the 1960s of sort of cultural revolution, Puritanism. They're sort of absolutely seeded by China's own propaganda drive through radio and print media. A few revolutionaries from Nepal and India travel to China to sort of gain military and political experience there. So there are some very clear links with China, but these movements go off in very interestingly different directions after this. So the Indian Maoist movement is sort of repressed by a very brutal state response in the 1970s, but it continues organising at the grassroots until it gathers greater energy after 2000, sort of particularly sort of the sort of eastern and northern part of the country. And one of the reasons why it gains traction at this point is Maoist activists champion the rights of ethnic minorities, the Adivasis, who are being sort of dispossessed by new sort of state liberalisation of big mining and developing contracts, which are sort of throwing many of these ethnic minorities off the forest that they've inhabited for hundreds and thousands of years. So a really important part of the success, I think, of Maoism in India is coming together with an environmental movement and also coming together to protecting the rights of ethnic minorities. And that sort of standing up for ethnic minorities is also a really important part of the success of Maoism in Nepal. But this marks a very interesting contrast with the way that Mao's ideas played out back in China. So back in China, Mao has been credited, if that's the right word, with waging war on nature. His sort of crash industrialization and collectivization projects were extremely destructive of the natural environment. And of course, China under Mao was repressively intolerant of the rights of ethnic minorities, which was seen play out in Tibet and Xinjiang. So some sort of very interesting adaptations, translations, mistranslations when Mao's ideas travelled into South Asia.
So, Julia, thank you so much. As you correctly note, certainly in the Euro-American world, we tend to have a narrative of history that the big battle of the 20th century, after World War II at least, was between capitalism and communism being thought of almost exclusively in terms of Soviet Union. When the wall falls in 1989, the view in the West was capitalism wins, and thus ends our narrative. And you've argued brilliantly that no, that narrative is really wrong, that Maoism has been and continues to be an incredibly important force in the world. And you've written a global history that really forces us to rethink our understanding of these past 80 years. So on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you for writing such an extraordinary book. Thank you for writing such a captivating book that, as we've noted, just brings the reader into these incredible stories, these incredible figures, these incredible moments of history, and forcing all of us to rethink what we thought was going on in these past 80 years. So thank you. It is an extraordinary book. And thank you also more immediately for being here with us today. This has been a wonderful discussion. And thank you for bringing all of your insights to a larger audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Michael, for helping us to unravel the complexities of Maoism and China. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @JaipurLitFest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.